So the generic title was the everyday use of money, and I've decided in this session to focus on a very specific record which has lots of information and some of which you'll already be reading on the handout. But before I do that, a little bit of background information on the period I'm going to examine today, which is the 18th century. As you heard, I've worked on mostly credit before in the 16th and 17th century, and the evidence for this is pretty overwhelming through the amount of litigation over credit you find in the courts. However, from the late 17th century and certainly by 1750, the decline in this litigation is incredibly quick. So they're going from thousands, hundreds of thousands of suits to almost nothing by 1750. Now, some work was done by one of my PhD students on transferable paper, and let's get the right, previously in one of the previous sessions that Kuroda organized, and some people were there in Tokyo, I examined how this worked in a small town. So I have looked at a small place called Glastonbury, where you see this local scrivener creating small bills, notes, bonds, based largely on the security of mortgages, which move within a very small rural community. And this is also a community where we can definitely see a lack of cash. In his memoirs, he mentions paper many, many hundreds of times, but very rarely does he mention coins. And if we look at the histories of money for the 18th century, we see the same thing. A great lack of especially small change. There isn't such a great lack of gold currency, guineas, worth 21 shillings and above. But in terms of silver or any form of copper currency, there is not much being produced. And I don't know if this is clear enough to see, but this is a sort of chart I made, which I published in an article a while back, trying to figure out all the different sorts of money produced in the 18th century and the amount and numbers. And here we have silver coins, not very many, and not so many copper coins. And you see when, so copper, by the government anyway, is only produced 1701, 1719, a bit later. So every so often they make some copper farthings, but not very often. Right. So what I want to move on to today and focus on, and this was actually another graduate student said, oh, there's all sorts of money you can find in the Old Bailey records from pickpocketing cases. So I just took a look, and in fact, you can find all sorts of examples of money. So I'm just trying to investigate today just how we might use this evidence. So I don't know if any of you are aware what the Old Bailey is, so I will start by describing it. It is the central criminal court. I mean, if you watch British TV, Rumpole of the Bailey, you might have heard of. Central British Criminal Court for cases occurring in London and the county of Middlesex. So it is trying cases, almost all of which occur within the metropolis of London, which is many hundreds of thousands of people by the 18th century. And the good thing about it is a wonderful digitalization project, one of the first big digitalization projects in Britain, put all the records from the beginning right through, I think now to the end of the 19th century online. So It's all public access. You can search Old Bailey online, and they have a search engine, and you go there, and you can look up types of offenses. You can look up names, and you can look up keywords. So it's all digitally searchable. So that's why you can put in some types of money, which is what I've done and which I'm going to talk about. Now, before we start, I have to describe sort of what the important limitations of this source are. And the first one, as you can see from this table, is the vast majority of cases tried in this court are thefts. Around 90%. Then sexual offenses, probably the next highest, killing. Royal offenses are very interesting because what a royal offense is almost always coining or counterfeiting, because it's treason in England, so that falls under royal offense. So you do get a lot of interesting cases about counterfeiting occurring in the capital, and then a few other things. But obviously, because theft is so important, you're going to get a lot of references of money being stolen. But that's not to say that isn't interesting. But what we can't do because of this bias is use it as a source which provides anything like a cross-section of society. I mean, as you might imagine, when people are going to break into a house or pick pockets, they are going to go somewhere where there's likely to be something worth stealing. So you're not going to get a lot of poor people being robbed. And oh dear. Right. Oh, there was another slide in between. Maybe not. Anyway, I'll describe it. There's also much qualitative evidence to suggest that much of the kingdom's monetary flow is centering on London, and increasingly so over the 18th century, because it is a center for all sorts of payments. It's the center of almost all wholesaling between the rest of the world and England. Payments for taxation are obviously flowing in from the country, as well as county gentlemen who spend some of the year, say at Parliament, in the city, need to remit some of their money earned from rents. And we can see this in a sample of inventory studied by the historian Peter Earle from the period 1665 to 1720. The average amount of cash possessed by these relatively well-off London middle-class people was £254. If you were to look in the rest of the country, you'd find an average of probably less than £1 or two, so vastly more. And if you work out the number of London merchants, which Richard Graspie did, he suggests there are about 8,000, around 1,700. If they all had this much money, they would have somewhere around a quarter of the cash in the nation. So it's likely to be an area of the country where there is more cash around. So with these things aside, I think it is a good sample, though, of how middling sort London tradesmen use different sorts of coin and paper. So I think it can be used to compare the use of different things and also to demonstrate change over time. And this is what is done in this table. So if you can read this, this is mention of different forms of money in all the cases, and this is about 60,000 cases over the whole of the period. These ones are a bit artificially low because they're incomplete, but from the 1720s we have complete records surviving and have been transcribed. The blue is shillings, red is pence, green is crowns, and the purple is banknotes. Now, unfortunately, I had to do this quite recently, and it turns out that the search engine is broken a bit. So while you can do Boolean searches to find individual examples, their statistical search, for some reason, is separate, and the Boolean search is broken. So I have to look up banknote, banknotes, and bank and notes. You can't search as a phrase. You get a lot of noise, like, the victim was stabbed and thrown over the bank, reading a bank of a. So when I get this fixed, I'll be able to do this much better, but I couldn't fix it in time for my presentation. So I had to go through and do some just samples of, for most of these, I looked at 200 real cases and eliminated a certain percent. And even with a good search engine working, of course, shillings and pence are going to be used often to describe values. So there's no way around that but to go through and either go through the whole lot and count the ones you need, or do a sampling technique. So I've done that here, but again, for only 200, and it would be best to do some more. So with those caveats aside, obviously what is very significant here is the rise, and this is, I should mention, percentage of all the total cases. So here we have shillings mentioned at over 30%. So banknotes are becoming more important. Where is it? The interesting thing is how often shillings are appearing, and this is despite the fact that the mint is hardly producing any of them. So this does indicate that there is more currency floating around in London waiting to be stolen. Yes. This is the absolute numbers. So again, there we have numbers of instances.
So 1780s is the number of shillings stolen?
No, it's the number of cases where shillings appear. Yeah, if you wanted to add up the total value, you'd need a research team, I think, or a long time, because you have to read every single. Yeah. No, this is just the number of times some amount of shillings are stolen. Yeah. Or, well, not always stolen. Sometimes it could be mentioned in witness deposition. So if it's a rape or something, I went into an alehouse and, I offered the woman a certain number of shillings. So it's actual uses, yes. So either appearance somewhere or a use. So it's a mention of a shilling or a pence or a banknote. And, so just as a sort of test, I looked at the killings. So the theft is eliminated. And the interesting thing to look here is when you eliminate the sort of factor. I mean, killings are probably weighted more to a lower social group, but anyway, there would certainly be less weighted towards the wealthy. You see more pennies and very few banknotes. So yes, they're not playing a role in. No, these are just.
So banknotes, it's an order. So mostly Bank of England notes.
Most of them tend to be Bank of England notes, but sometimes it just says banknote. Sometimes they use different words. Promissory note. I think there's some examples on the handout. There's quite a few note of hand, which is, I presume, not a banknote. But most of them are, so far, for the Bank of England. But again, you have to read through every single case. Or once the Boolean search works a bit better, then be interesting. But this is just an example of, here we have a note of hand. And a type of theft. So what I find very interesting, and I'll go through some of the examples, still got time, is what you can see from these quite detailed descriptions is the interplay of goods, metallic money, and paper. For obvious reasons, oral credit or book credit does not appear that often in the records, so you can't use it to work out how those things are interacted. But there you can see, silver candlestick, snuffers in a stand being tried to sell to a silversmith, I guess. And says, I don't have cash enough, so I asked him to change me a banknote of £20. So he goes off somewhere else to try to get it changed. Here's a promissory note from a case involving a weaver, which I think is quite interesting. Sailors from Hudson's Bay House. And so after some disputes, I lent him first £3, then 20 shillings, and he wrote this note and signed the receipts to receive the money. Here is a case of a prostitute, I guess. Yes, I think. And note of hand of £3, 3 shillings. So evidence of notes of hand being used. Now, you've noticed I didn't put copper or other small money. Token money, we know shops issued tokens, but if you search for tokens, you find hardly any. I did look for groats, mentioned only 50 times in the whole period. Copper, again, has the problem, like shillings, in that many items of kitchenware made of copper are stolen. So if you look up copper, sometimes you get coins, but most of the time you get copper kitchenware, the amount of which is going up tremendously in the 18th century if you're interested in consumption. But here is one case where copper is mentioned. And interestingly, they're mentioning here a copper ticket. So the word ticket, which at least I associate with some form of paper, is obviously being used in a rather precise meaning here. And I think what we would call a token, sometimes they're calling a ticket. Okay, now, before I go on to this, to finish up, I'll just briefly go through, I mean, we don't have time to look through all of these, but if you have a chance to read them, just a few things to note. In the first example, from a theft from a laborer, here is one of the rare cases where you can look at a laborer who, after he's a bricklayer's laborer, he meets a woman on a cold night. They go off to drink a gin together, and he accuses her of stealing some stuff. And he says, the reckoning at the gin shop came to 8 pence. I had a brass box in my pocket with 2 guineas in it and a note upon command for £6, 6 shillings and other matters. So we can tell that even a laborer is keeping a note of hand, and he's got a little brass box instead of a purse. The next one is an example of a theft of some banknotes. There's quite a bit of highway robbery in here around London, and what I think is interesting about this, they open up some letters and find 3 exchequer notes of £100 each, 3 banknotes, £20, a banknote of £35. Interesting, which they think is a very odd sum. So presumably banks were not often issuing £35 notes, together with a lot of other silver and gold. And at the bottom, I think it's quite significant that they go into an alehouse near the bank and call for a porter to go to the bank to receive the money. So presumably, a porter is either, he could be a gate porter at some institution, but most likely someone that carries goods around the city. So quite an ordinary person they're getting to go off. Of course, he fails because all the bank notes, as you'll see in some of the other examples, have numbers. And we can trace through some of these examples how the circulation of these banknotes is monitored by people writing down the number. It's like an endorsement. So again, it's a relation to the bookkeeping sort of. You have to certainly be literate to circulate these banknotes, and quite often you can see from these cases sort of people tracing back and the judges asking witnesses, did you really know the number of that banknote? Yes, I did. So then another case of forgery in the next page, and I won't go into that one. Then a very interesting case, a detailed case of forging a banknote from page 7, where it actually copies out the note, which is very simple, surprisingly simple given that it's for £6,400. And as it turns out, it doesn't fool the court. There's quite a nice long description of how they identify these notes from writing. It says, the manner of this note differed not a little from the manner of Mr. Gibson's writing. Mr. Gibson never uses the phrase for value received. Other remarks, the bottom of the 2 E's are made with a bungling figure. Ridiculous to think that Mr. Gibson should ever draw a note of such consequence on a diminutive scrap of paper. Besides, he seems to have folded it up. And on it goes. So, and this kind of thick description, I think, is wonderful. And then it goes on, and the intricacies of how they're trying to use this enormous amount of money at different places. And you'll see names you will recognize, like Horace Bank and Janeway's Coffee House and things like that. But in the end, they're foiled. I think went a bit too far trying to cash 6,000, almost 6,500. Then there's just a clipping case if you're interested. I won't go into that, but how the filings are kept. Then another case of a rare mention of copper money on page 12. A weaver, and this very interesting because he keeps 192 halfpence, the quality of 8 shillings, in a cupboard. And somebody's broken in and stolen them. Yes, then I think the last one, page 13, there's all sorts of interesting things in here. So we have, 12 pence in a canvas bag, 47 guineas, 6 half guineas, a quarter guinea, 4 half crowns, 3 threepences, 21 pieces of foreign copper coin called doits, value 6 pence, a piece of foreign copper coin called a liard, value a halfpenny, then other monies, and then some various banknotes. And this fellow calls him, he's a gardener, but in fact, quite a wealthy gardener is hiring other people. And presumably a woman who worked for him as a maidservant has broken in through his attic and got into his chest, or not his chest, but his desk where he keeps all the money. A very common means of keeping this money in London is desks with obviously locked drawers, but also secret drawers as well. And she obviously somehow knows where his secret drawer is. And he goes on and on. And this is a case where you look on the top of page 15, they do ask the number. One of the judges asking, upon your oath, you lost it. Did you know the number of it? I described the particulars of it to Mr. Macaulay before he showed it to me. And then he asks, the Macaulay is someone that has been given the note to buy some goods. The prosecutor is the fellow who had the goods stolen in the English system. The victim is the prosecutor. Pawnbroker comes in. A lot of these cases involve pawnbrokers. And then he says, here is a Flemish halfpenny amongst them, which has a mark upon the edge by which I know it. There are 2 of the doits have holes through them. I have had them years and know them well. They are in a snuff box with a gold ring. Why is he keeping all this copper foreign currency in his snuff box for years? An interesting question. You must have some reason for it. Then just briefly before concluding, another way of looking at this evidence, especially the rise of banknotes, are mentions in newspapers. And another online source, the Burney collection of newspapers, digitalized. And you don't get nearly as many correct hits on this because it's OCR, whereas the Old Bailey was transcribed by people in India. But it's getting better, and certainly for long phrases like banknotes, and it does have a proper Boolean search, you can find the numbers, and that's just an example. You've probably been reading it. And most of them are people that lose the banknotes, and they almost always give the number. So these numbers are quite important. And this is the percentage of entries coming up in the newspapers, most of which are news sheets, advertising news sheets and things like that. Again, in percentages. But again, quite a lot already at the beginning of the 1700s. And interestingly, a sort of even spread throughout the century. This, though, is the numbers, the number of times. Obviously, the number of newspapers is increasing quite dramatically, which is why there's a big difference. But whether people before weren't able to, I mean, they're all in London as well, I should say. So it could be that, if you lose a banknote and there's only 5 newspapers, you're always going to advertise it, and then this is a more accurate representation. I'm not quite sure. Okay, so in conclusion, so what can we make of this, and how can I bring it into the themes of the conference? Well, I think it is very interesting in some of the themes that Kuroda outlined in the now very well-known quadrant for parts of the quadrant, because it does show, at least in this area, which might be quite special, how all sorts of different means of exchange are being mixed up. Copper, paper, metallic coins, by the middling sort, and even if we see in the laborer that has these things in his little box, or the weaver, all seem to be working. And when we look at the processes by which, the first thing you do when you steal goods, especially metalware, is head to the pawnbroker right away, and quite often they'll try to get a note rather than cash. Whether this is a particular area of the economy for slightly dodgy people, or whether it is much more widespread for the poorer part of London, again, is something we need to investigate. But it also, can show differences in volume. So the rise of banknotes in London is obviously important, and without this source, very hard to see how they're interacting within the society. So, it's not by any means the same as a small town in Britain. It's the center of world trade. But I think it does show in much more detail than I'm used to from my other sources, how everyday people actually keep these items and use them when they go to sell things or when they are making transactions at banks. Okay, thank you.